both parties claiming stark differences in policy, but any immigration policy is on hold at the moment. This morning, Rishi Sunak said that Rwanda flights would not take off during the election period. We're going to have a quick chat with Kevin Saunders, former Chief Immigration Officer for the UK Border Force at Calais. Hello, Kevin.
Good afternoon.
Are you surprised that the Rwanda flights won't take off during the election period?
Yes, I was. I was very surprised, actually, but that's what the Prime Minister has said, so that's what's going to happen.
Do you really believe that the flights taking off would make a difference to the core of the problem, which is an attempt to stop the boats, isn't it? So the flights were going to take off in order to show the criminal gangs that they shouldn't take money off vulnerable people with the promise that they get to stay in the UK.
Yes, the flight taking off would have been a very visual thing. We must have a deterrent. There has to be a deterrent if we want to have any hope in trying to disrupt this awful trade. And the Rwanda scheme is the only deterrent on the table at the moment. So by not doing anything while the election is on, is not really a very good idea, because we know that if Labour win, then Rwanda isn't going to happen, and if that happens, then I shudder to think what the situation is going to be in the UK. We're going to be looking at 50,000 refugees this year.
How much do you think the numbers will go off when the weather changes across the channel?
When the weather gets nice, then the numbers are going to increase. The smuggling gangs are going to send everybody across that they possibly can during the fine weather. The numbers will be astronomical. And if we don't have a deterrent, then the numbers will be even worse, because the smuggling gangs can make a lot of money out of this. The chances of getting caught are not brilliantly high.
Mm. So net migration remains unusually high, says the ONS, but these official estimates suggest a 10% drop in numbers last year. So how are you squaring that circle?
Well, you can't really. I mean, the net figure is still too high. According to David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, he wanted it down into the tens of thousands. And it looks as though it's about 650,000 for last year, which is down 10%. But the trouble is we're giving too many visas. If you give out visas, people will come to the UK. And unfortunately, we did a deal with India on trade, which meant that we needed to give India more visas. So that was unfortunate, but that's what happened. So we've got to cut it back. We're getting some success on cutting it back with student dependents, but I don't know what Labour are going to do. We don't know what the Labour policy on this actually is.
What would you say would be the most helpful part of the net migration policy to change? So you've mentioned the dependence for students, and that has cut the numbers quite substantially. But where else would you turn your attention to?
Well, you've got to decide what you want to do. Now, at the moment, the government seem to want to bring in people to fill the jobs which they're saying they can't fill in the UK. And then on the other hand, they're saying that there are too many people claiming benefit that should actually be working. So it's a very, very difficult question. At the moment, if we cannot motivate our own workforce to work, then you have no option. You've got to bring people in from abroad.
Good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Kevin Saunders, former Chief Immigration Officer for the UK Border Force at Calais.
As I said, 15 European countries just the other week. all signed a statement saying that they think that has to be a part of the solution, because they're realising across Europe the penny is dropping, this challenge is growing, our security is being threatened, that's the only way to solve it. So I've got a clear plan. You've already seen, hopefully, some pictures in the papers and on telly. We've started detaining people. I can tell you the flights are booked for July, airfield's on standby, the escorts are ready, the caseworkers are churning through everything. So all that is happening, and if I'm re-elected as your Prime Minister, those flights will go to Rwanda. We will get that deterrent up and running.
Rishi Sunak. We have now with us Matt Dathan, the Home Affairs editor at The Times. Hello to you, Matt.
Good evening, John.
Hi. And Tony Colony's here too, RTE's Europe editor. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, John.
Hi. Matt, can I come to you first? So no flights to Rwanda before the election. That looks like a big hope for the Conservatives suddenly dashed.
Yes, that's right, and it's an admission of reality, really. Two reasons. One is that there's two now legal challenges already filed to the courts, and there was a warning from government lawyers that there's a real risk that the first flights will be delayed as a result of them. And the second is that the risk or the gamble that the government or the Conservatives would face if they went ahead with arranging the first flight in the just the days before the election, and then something went wrong, it was grounded or something else. It was just too great a risk to take.
And is it right, Matt, that there's a presumption inside Whitehall that that there would be maybe months of legal challenges before the asylum seekers could be deported? Months.
I wouldn't say assumption. I think more of a prospect, the possibility, and given the high stakes nature of the election, it was a risk that the Tories just didn't want to take. And actually, the Home Office is actually saying that the timetable and process hasn't changed. We always said it would be that week that flights would start. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that we were going to get a flight off before the 4th of July anyway.
Right. If there's a change of government in this general election, the Rwanda scheme will be kaput. Labour is committed simply to tearing it up, essentially. Meanwhile, Matt, what is the state of the scheme at Rwanda's end? What are they ready to do by way of taking in asylum seekers?
Well, for the last 2 years, they have said they stand ready. The preparations are all there. They've got the Hope Hostel, which is a capacity of about 200 to 300 people, and their asylum system has been completely overhauled since the Supreme Court in November, and they put all the mechanisms in place. And I would love to know what Paul Kagame is thinking. He actually faces his own election on the 15th of July. When he finds out on the 5th of July, if there's a change in government, as you say, that all the effort has been for nothing. Well, I guess not for completely nothing, because he's got a few £100 million for it.
Yes, a few £100 million of British taxpayers' money. And are we talking about a couple of hundred, only a couple of hundred? Because the Prime Minister has spoken about a drumbeat of planes taking off one after the other and deterring migrants from trying to cross the Channel. Is it just a couple of hundred, despite those millions?
Well, it's a couple of hundred in that particular hostel, and the Rwandan government said, look, when this scheme finally gets going, we've got other sites reserved that we can stand up at very short notice. And then obviously they're only a temporary accommodation, so once the asylum claims have been processed, then the idea is they would move into permanent accommodation, and therefore you'd have a rolling number through the system.
All right, Matt Dathan, thank you very much indeed. Good to talk to you. And Tony Connolly, RTE's Europe editor. Tell me, Tony, and welcome again. We hear the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, saying that the UK is leading the line in this, that 15 European countries want to follow Britain's example in a Rwanda-style scheme. How true is that, Tony?
It's certainly true that the debate in Europe has shifted, and that's in the context of the upcoming European elections. There's expected to be a big rise in the number of far-right and right-wing MEPs elected across the 27 member states. So I think the mainstream centre-right and centre-left and liberal groups within the parliament and in member states have been toughening up their rhetoric on migration. It is a concern for voters, obviously. But no one has gone as far as Britain has gone in the model of simply putting people on a flight after they've turned up in a boat and sending them to Rwanda for good, whether they achieve refugee status or not. There is a thing called the EU Migration Pact, which has been about 7 or 8 years in the making. It's finally been pretty much approved by member states and the European Parliament. And it does talk about processing asylum seekers in third countries, but that's simply processing their applications. They obviously want to, if it's clear that you're an economic migrant, that you're not a genuine refugee, then your procedure will be speeded up, and they want to send those people back or to safe third countries. The European People's Party, which is the main centre-right grouping in the Parliament, and that's where Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, sits, their manifesto has talked about processing asylum applications in third countries. Now, they haven't spelled out the name Rwanda per se, but Ursula von der Leyen recently stressed that anything they do along those lines would be in line with the Geneva Convention on Refugees and in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. I think drawing a line between the British approach and any European approach.
Right. So the European discussion is about screening potential asylum seekers, about processing them in another country, not deporting them on a one-way ticket, which is the British plan, and is rather different in that way. Are there countries though to receive people even for screening?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right in that the EU is looking at it in a different way, although I think there would be individual member states who are, quite tempted by the British approach. Certainly Denmark was in discussion with Rwanda about taking in asylum seekers or refugees. Now, it wasn't clear whether that was simply for processing or sending them there for good.
Yeah.
And Denmark dropped that approach after they come under a lot of criticism from other EU member states. And so Denmark is now in the business of looking for an EU approach. So there is that differentiation there. But again, this EU migration pact is quite a sweeping new set of policies that would, it is hoped by certainly EU governments, would dissuade people from trying to get into Europe simply for economic reasons. Those kind of people would have their applications processed a lot more quickly. They'd be fast-tracked. There would be detention at the front line for those kind of asylum seekers or migrants. And even women and children could face detention, and that's caused a lot of upset and dissent in the European political sphere. But again, I think it's safe to say that while Europe wants to get tougher than it has been on this issue, they haven't gone quite so far as the British Rwanda model.
Right. Now, meanwhile,